The wind howled like a ghost across the frozen plains of rural Montana, whipping thick snow in swirls across the deserted country road. Jack Morrison, a retired U.S. Army veteran, gripped the wheel of his old Ford F-150 with one gloved hand while sipping lukewarm coffee from a metal thermos with the other. The roads were slick and silent, exactly how he liked them. After years of loud battles, chaos, and military noise, Jack had grown to love the quiet. The remote winters in Montana, as brutal as they were, offered him a kind of stillness that couldn't be bought. But that morning, something broke the stillness. Out of the corner of his eye, as he rounded a bend shaded by pines, Jack noticed movement in the snowbank on the right. At first, he thought it was just a bush weighed down by ice or maybe a coyote scavenging. But when he slowed the truck and squinted through the flurries, his heart froze. Two German shepherds lay curled together at the base of a snow-covered tree. Their coats were crusted with ice, their bodies shivering violently, and one of them wasn't moving at all. Jack hit the brakes so hard the truck skidded a little before stopping. He leaped out, instantly hit by the sting of cold wind on his face. Snow crunched under his boots as he hurried toward the dogs. Years of military service had taught him how to move swiftly and carefully, and he used that now not to face enemies, but to approach two frightened, freezing animals without alarming them. "Easy now," he murmured, kneeling in the snow. "I'm not gonna hurt you." The first shepherd, the larger of the two, lifted its head weakly. Its eyes were glassy and filled with a mix of fear and exhaustion. Jack could see every rib pressing through its thin fur. The second shepherd didn't react at all. It looked half buried in the snow, as if it had stopped trying to survive hours ago. Jack's breath caught in his throat. His mind flashed back to another shepherd, one he had loved more than some of the men in his unit. Shadow. Shadow had been his military working dog, sharp, loyal, and unflinching. Shadow had saved Jack's life during an ambush in Kandahar, alerting him just seconds before an improvised explosive device detonated ahead. Shadow had died in that explosion, while Jack had lived. The guilt had haunted him ever since. Looking at these two dogs now, something deep inside him cracked open. Jack shrugged off his thick parka and gently laid it over the dog that wasn't moving. He slid his arms under the limp body and lifted it slowly, cradling it against his chest. The cold seeped through his flannel shirt, but he didn't care. He turned to the truck and laid the shepherd on the passenger seat, adjusting the heater vents to blow directly on it. Then he went back. For the second, this one was slightly more alert, but it flinched as Jack reached for it. "It's okay," he whispered. "I've got you." He extended his hand slowly, letting the dog sniff his glove before lifting it with care. The moment their eyes met, something passed between them: recognition, trust, a flicker of hope. Jack carried the second dog to the truck, placing it gently on the back seat with some of the blankets he kept in his emergency kit. Back behind the wheel, Jack turned the heat to full blast and sped toward his cabin. It was nearly 40 minutes away over icy roads, but he didn't slow down. His jaw was clenched, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. As he drove, he glanced at the dogs. The front seat shepherd's chest rose and fell slowly. "Still alive? For now, hang in there," he muttered. "Don't quit on me." He remembered saying those words to Shadow once, after a firefight that had left both of them bleeding. Shadow hadn't made it. Jack prayed these two would. When he finally pulled up to his cabin, nestled in a thick forest of pine and birch, he didn't waste time. He carried both dogs inside, one at a time, laying them near the wood stove. The warmth of the cabin made their breaths visible but weak. Jack stoked the fire, grabbed extra blankets, and used clean towels to gently dry their fur. Then he opened a can of chicken broth and warmed it in a pot. He spooned some into a shallow dish and held it under the stronger dog's nose. The shepherd sniffed, then began lapping slowly. That was a good sign. The other dog, however, didn't respond. Jack wrapped it tighter in a blanket and checked its paws. Frostbite. Bad. Its ears were crusted with ice. Its pads swollen and cracked. "You've been out here a long time, haven't you?" Jack said, more to himself than the dog. He stayed up through the night, rotating hot water bottles, feeding them broth every few hours, and whispering softly. He spoke about Shadow, about the war, about the silence that had followed him home. The dogs didn't reply, but their eyes stayed on him. And for the first time in years, Jack didn't feel alone. At dawn, the snow outside finally stopped falling. The dogs were still alive, but weak. Jack knew he had to get them to a vet fast. He loaded them back into the truck, this time with his coat still wrapped around one. As he drove toward the nearest town an hour away, he felt something stirring in him, a kind of purpose, a reason to act. He didn't know where this journey would lead, but he knew one thing. He wasn't just saving them, they were saving him too. The drive to town was slow and tense. Snowdrifts piled high on either side of the narrow road, and the tires occasionally slipped on hidden patches of ice. But Jack Morrison barely noticed. His eyes flicked back and forth between the road and the two dogs resting in his truck. The larger one lay curled on the front seat with Jack's thick parka wrapped around its trembling body. The smaller one, now partially revived, sat quietly in the back, eyes fixed on Jack as if trying to make sense of him. Every bump in the road made Jack flinch. He'd spent most of his life under pressure in war zones where one wrong step could end everything, but this was a different kind of fear. These dogs were hanging by a thread, and Jack wasn't sure he could pull them through. But something inside him had already changed. As the engine hummed and the heater whirred, Jack's thoughts wandered back to a day he rarely let himself remember. The day Shadow died. It had been a routine patrol in Kandahar. Jack and Shadow had worked together for nearly 2 years by then. They trusted each other without question. Shadow had been trained to detect explosives and had already saved their unit 3 times. That day, they were sweeping a dusty village road when Shadow suddenly stopped. His ears perked. Then he barked once, loud and urgent. Jack froze. He didn't ask questions. He dropped flat just as the IED went off. Shadow had moved to shield Jack without hesitation. The explosion sent debris flying, and when Jack got up moments later, bleeding from his shoulder, Shadow was lying still. Eyes open, no sound, no breath. Jack had screamed his name until his voice gave out. But the dog didn't move. After that, something in Jack had shut down. He finished his tour, accepted his discharge, and retreated to the Montana wilderness. He built a life of solitude, chopping firewood and fishing, speaking to almost no one. Shadow's collar hung by the fireplace in his cabin. He hadn't looked at it in years. But now, as he glanced at the German shepherds in his truck, something stirred. It wasn't just sympathy. It wasn't pity. It was personal. These dogs didn't feel like strangers. They felt like echoes of souls he could still save. Finally, Jack reached the edge of town and turned into the gravel driveway of the only veterinary clinic for miles. Marsh Animal Care. The hand-painted sign out front swayed slightly in the wind. The building itself was small but warm-looking, smoke drifting from a metal chimney pipe. Jack parked and jumped out, gently lifting the weaker of the 2 dogs in his arms. He carried it inside without even knocking. "Someone help me," he called. A woman in her mid-40s with her hair in a ponytail and a lab coat dusted with fur looked up from the counter. Her name tag read, Dr. Helen Marsh. "Oh my God," she said, rushing over. "What happened?" "Found them by the road," Jack said, breathing heavily. "Middle of the woods. Snow was coming down hard. One of them's barely breathing." Helen gestured him to an exam room and motioned for her assistant to bring a blanket and IV kit. Jack gently laid the dog on the table while Helen checked its heartbeat, breathing, and gums. "Frostbite," she muttered. "Dehydration. Malnutrition. This one's on the edge." The second dog, now cautiously stepping into the clinic under Jack's direction, watched Helen with guarded eyes. "I think they've been out there a while," Jack said quietly. "They didn't come from nowhere." Helen nodded. "Let me scan for chips." She pulled a small wand-like device from a drawer and ran it over each dog's neck. The first yielded no result. The second, after a moment, emitted a soft beep. "There's a chip in this one," she said, walking over to the computer. "Let's see." Jack waited, heart pounding. "Registered to Stevenson Breeding Kennels." Her face darkened. That place was shut down last year for neglect and abuse. Over 30 dogs were confiscated, but the report said some were never found. Jack's stomach turned. So these 2 were dumped. Helen nodded grimly. "Most likely. They were probably hiding, surviving off scraps, until the snow made that impossible." Jack looked down at the 2 dogs, his fists clenched. Someone had abandoned them in the woods like garbage, left them to freeze to death. He couldn't understand how anyone could be so cruel. "I'll do everything I can," Helen said, "but we're not out of the woods yet. They'll need fluids, antibiotics, and round-the-clock care. I'll stay with them," Jack said, firmly. Helen looked at him, surprised. "You sure?" Jack nodded. "They're not just dogs to me." Helen saw something in his eyes, something heavy, haunted, but full of quiet strength. She didn't ask questions. "All right then, we'll set up some space in the back." Over the next 12 hours, Jack barely left their side. He sat on the floor beside the kennels, feeding the dogs broth, monitoring their vitals with Helen, and whispering softly whenever they stirred. He named the stronger one Valor for its courage. The weaker one, he called Hope because that's all she had left. By nightfall, Hope's breathing had stabilized. Valor had even licked Jack's hand once. Helen watched him with quiet admiration. "You're good with them," she said. Jack shrugged. "I had a dog. In the army. Shadow, he was better than most men I served with." Helen nodded. "Sounds like you miss him." Jack didn't reply, but the silence said enough. Later, when Helen brought in dinner for them both, she asked, "What are you going to do with them?" Jack looked at the kennel, where Hope was curled up against Valor. For the first time in years, he felt something stirring in his chest that wasn't pain. It was the faintest flicker of purpose. "I don't know yet," he said, "but I'm not leaving them behind." That night at the clinic was one Jack Morrison would never forget. The room was quiet except for the steady hum of the medical machines and the soft ticking of the old wall clock. Hope and Valor rested on padded mats beside a heater in the back of the veterinary clinic. 4 bags slowly dripped life-saving fluids into their veins. The temperature outside had dropped below zero, but inside, the warmth was returning not just to their bodies, but to something in Jack's soul. He didn't sleep, not even for a second. Instead, he sat between the 2 dogs, legs crossed, back against the wall. His weathered hands rested on his knees, and his eyes flicked between the canine companions as if watching for enemy movement. Not because he didn't trust the clinic, but because his instincts wouldn't let him rest. Back in Afghanistan, he had done this 100 times, keeping watch overnight in unfamiliar places, making sure his team, his dog, and the civilians around them stayed safe. Now, years later, he was doing it again. Not for his country, but for 2 nearly frozen souls. Around midnight, Valor stirred and let out a quiet whimper. Jack moved to him immediately, kneeling beside the mat. "Easy, buddy, you're okay." He stroked the dog's ears gently, using the same tone he once used with Shadow. Valor responded with a slow blink and reached out to rest his muzzle on Jack's knee. That simple gesture, Silani, broke him. Jack blinked hard and stared at the ceiling. "I'm not losing you too," he whispered. Across the room, Hope let out a weak sigh. Jack went to her next, brushing his fingers through her matted fur. She was still weaker than Valor, but Helen said her vitals had improved since the 4 drip began. It gave him hope, the very thing he'd named her after. By 2 a.m., the storm outside had died down. Helen came in wearing a heavy coat over her scrubs and carrying a thermos of hot tea. "He's still awake?" she asked softly. Jack nodded. "They haven't left my mind for a second." Helen sat beside him, pouring 2 cups. "They've got a strong will to live. That's rare with dogs that have suffered like this." Jack sipped the tea slowly. "They didn't give up. That means I won't either." Helen looked at him carefully, then smiled. "You're not just helping them. I think they're helping you too." Jack didn't answer. He didn't need to. The next morning, after a quiet few hours where both dogs finally drifted into true sleep, Helen returned with an idea. "I've been thinking," she said, "if these dogs were part of that breeder scandal, maybe others are still out there." Jack looked up sharply. "You think they dumped more?" Helen nodded. "That facility was shut down for overcrowding and cruelty. Dozens of dogs were taken. 2 shelters, but some were reported missing, ran off before the authorities arrived. These 2 could have been strays ever since." Jack felt his stomach tighten. "We can't just leave it like that." "You already saved 2, Helen said gently. "That's more than most people would ever do." Jack stood, stretching his aching joints. "That's not enough." Later that day, he called the sheriff's office and offered to help search the woods near where he found the dogs. The deputy promised to follow up, but Jack didn't wait. The minute Hope and Valor were well enough to stand on their own, he planned to go looking for others. If 2 had survived this long, maybe more had too. That evening, back at the clinic, Jack sat beside the recovering dogs with a notepad in his lap. He was drawing sketches of Shadow, of Hope, of Valor. In the margins, he scribbled words he hadn't dared write in years: healing, purpose, trust, second chances. At one point, Valor nudged his elbow, knocking the pencil from his fingers. Jack chuckled softly. "Not bad for someone who almost froze to death." Helen peeked in. "They're responding better than I hoped. They trust you." Jack nodded. "It's mutual." Then something happened that stopped both of them cold. Hope, the weaker of the 2, slowly stood. Her legs trembled like saplings in a windstorm, but she found her balance. With quiet determination, she limped across the mat and laid down beside Jack's leg, pressing her head gently against his foot. Helen covered her mouth, watching in awe. Jack swallowed hard. "She's choosing to stay with me." Helen nodded. "She knows what you've done for her." Jack leaned down and whispered, "You're safe now." That night, as the fire crackled in the clinic's back room, Jack told Helen more about Shadow, about the ambush, about the guilt, about why he moved to Montana to disappear from a world that felt like it had no more use for broken soldiers. "You're not broken," Helen said quietly. "You're someone who carries the weight of love." Jack nodded but said nothing. Before leaving for the night, Helen turned in the doorway. "You could take them home soon, if you're willing. They'd be safe with you." "I already knew that," Jack replied. The next morning, Jack loaded Hope and Valor into his truck. This time, they were awake, alert, and watching him closely. The journey back to his cabin wasn't silent. Jack talked to them the whole way, telling them stories of the land, the nearby river, and the pine forest where deer often wandered past his window. When they reached the cabin, Jack opened the door and let them step inside. Hope hesitated. Valor sniffed the air. Then slowly, they entered. Jack closed the door behind them and whispered, "Welcome home." Snow had stopped falling, but the ground outside Jack Morrison's cabin still held a thick, icy blanket. Smoke rose steadily from the chimney as warmth returned, not only to the old wooden home, but to the hearts inside it. Hope and Valor, once barely clinging to life, now slowly adapted to their new It had only been 2 days since Jack brought them home, but the difference was remarkable. Valor was already moving around, exploring the corners of the cabin with cautious curiosity. His ears perked up at every creak in the wood, every whistle of wind through the window frame. He followed Jack from room to room like a silent shadow. Hope, though still fragile, had begun lifting her head when Jack entered the room. She even managed a few careful steps toward him that morning, her tail giving the slightest wag when he knelt to greet her. Jack had transformed his living room into a recovery space. Blankets lined the floor, a soft fire burned low in the hearth, and food and water bowls were kept full and fresh. He spent nearly every waking moment beside them, helping Hope stand, guiding Valor outdoors when needed, speaking softly and with the kind of love only someone who'd known loss could give. But something still worried him. Hope's breathing was sometimes labored. Her eyes, while filled with trust, held a lingering cloudiness. Jack knew she wasn't out of danger yet. So, the next day, he made the drive back to town and brought both dogs for another checkup with Dr. Helen Marsh. Helen was already waiting outside the clinic when Jack pulled up. "You've done a miracle," she said, watching the two dogs hop out of the truck with far more energy than before. "They're like new." "Not new yet," Jack said, giving Hope a quick pat. "Still healing, especially her." Helen led them inside and began the second round of evaluations. She weighed both dogs, checked their heart rates, examined their paws, and gently felt along their ribs and legs. Then she took blood samples. "They're gaining weight," she said with a smile, "especially Valor. He's a fighter." Jack nodded. "And Hope?" Helen's face turned more serious. She leaned in and examined Hope's eyes closely, then opened her mouth and pressed gently on her gums. "She's recovering physically," Helen said, "but I'm concerned about her lungs. She still has some shallow breathing. I want to run more tests." Jack didn't hesitate. "Do whatever it takes." While the blood work processed, Helen walked into the back room and returned with a small scanner. "Let's try the microchip again," she said. "Sometimes they read better when the dog's healthier." Jack steadied Hope as Helen scanned her neck and shoulders. This time the device beeped. "There we go," she said softly. She walked to her computer and typed in the registration number. Jack waited, tension thick in the air. Helen's eyes narrowed. "You're not going to like this." Jack stepped closer. "What is it?" "The chip is registered to a facility in Idaho. The same owners as the breeder we discussed before. They had multiple locations, one in Montana, one just over the state line. Both were shut down by federal order last year. Some animals were seized, but several were reported missing." She turned the screen so Jack could see. A grainy photo showed a younger Hope, barely a year old, standing in a cage with rusted bars. Jack clenched his jaw. They were dumped. Likely during the investigation, Helen confirmed. They were liabilities. The owners couldn't sell them and didn't want to be fined again, so they abandoned them. Jack looked down at Hope. She was now curled at his feet, her head resting on her paws, unaware that her tragic past had just resurfaced. "She deserves better," he said quietly. Helen agreed. "They both do." When the blood work returned, Helen gave Jack the update. "Hope's white blood cell count is still elevated. She's fighting off a secondary infection. We'll need to put her on a longer antibiotic cycle and monitor her lungs." Jack didn't blink. "Give me the medication. I'll handle it." "You're doing more than anyone could ask," Helen said. "I don't care what anyone else would do," Jack replied. "I'm not letting them go through this alone." Helen handed him the prescription, along with a long list of care instructions and follow-up appointments. As Jack loaded Hope and Valor back into his truck, something shifted in his mind. It wasn't just about saving two dogs anymore. It was about doing something bigger. These animals had been abused, neglected, abandoned, forgotten. And yet, they had survived. They had trusted him, bonded with him, and in doing so, they had reminded Jack what it meant to care again. On the drive home, Jack looked in the rearview mirror. Hope sat in the back seat, wrapped in a blanket, eyes closed but peaceful. Valor was up front, his head resting on Jack's armrest. "You were thrown away," Jack said quietly, "but not anymore." That evening, after settling the dogs in, Jack sat down at his small writing desk for the first time in years. He opened an old spiral notebook, flipped past empty pages, and began writing. 3 weeks after the rescue, Jack Morrison's quiet cabin had transformed into a place of life, warmth, and movement. Hope and Valor had come a long way from the snowbank, where Jack first found them. Their coats were thicker, their eyes brighter, and their trust in him stronger than ever. The two dogs followed him everywhere through the woods behind his cabin, along the river trail, even as he chopped firewood in the frosty yard. The three of them had developed a silent rhythm, like a small unit working as one. Jack hadn't realized how empty his life had been until it wasn't anymore. Every bark from Valor or nudge from Hope reminded him that real, honest connection was something he still deserved. But something bigger was coming. It started with a knock on his cabin door. Jack opened it to find a woman bundled in a red parka and holding a camera bag. Her eyes were bright, her breath fogging in the cold air. "Mr. Morrison," she asked. "I'm Sarah Clemens, with the local news. I heard about what you did with the dogs." Jack raised an eyebrow. "You're a little late, I know," she smiled, "but I think your story is just getting started." He hesitated. Jack had never wanted attention. He preferred being unnoticed, forgotten. But then Valor nudged his leg, and Hope padded up beside him, as if to remind him, this wasn't about him anymore. "Come in," Jack said. Sarah stayed for 2 hours, recording footage of Jack playing with the dogs, cooking their meals, showing the thick file Dr. Helen Marsh had compiled on their medical recovery. She filmed the scars on Valor's legs and the patchy fur that still hadn't grown back over Hope's ribs. Most of all, she captured the bond between a war-hardened man and 2 dogs who had every reason not to trust humans, but did. "I've covered a lot of stories," Sarah said before leaving. "But this is something people need to see." Jack shrugged. If it helps one person treat a dog better, it's worth it. He didn't think much of it again until a few days later, when his phone began buzzing. It was an old flip phone, barely functioning, and the screen flashed with calls and texts he didn't recognize. The story had aired. Then it was picked up by the state's largest news outlet. Then the national network by the weekend. Jack's porch was stacked with letters and packages. People from across the country sent handwritten notes, donations, collars, food, toys, and even knitted sweaters with Hope and Valor embroidered on them. He wasn't just the quiet veteran in the woods anymore. He was the man who stopped everything to save 2 dying dogs. The phone calls continued. "Would you appear on a morning show? Would you do a podcast? Could we fly you and the dogs to New York?" Jack said no to most. He didn't want fame. He didn't want flashing cameras or microphones shoved in his face. But he did say yes to one interview with the National Veterans Network. The segment focused less on the dogs' condition and more on what the experience had awakened. In Jack, he spoke quietly but powerfully about PTSD, isolation, and the silent wounds soldiers carried home. And then, how 2 German shepherds had pulled him out of a darkness he hadn't even fully understood. "I went out for groceries," he said in the interview, "and I found my purpose instead." The video was shared over 10 million times in a single week. Veterans from all branches wrote to him, some with tears in their messages, others just saying thank you. One letter stood out. It was from a Marine in Arizona. "I was ready to quit. Your story reminded me that there's still something worth getting up for. I adopted a shelter dog today, named him Chance. I think you saved us both." Jack read that letter 3 times before folding it and placing it on the mantel above the fireplace. As the weeks went on, Jack began receiving visitors, other veterans, local animal lovers, curious reporters. At first, he was overwhelmed, but then he noticed something strange happening. People didn't just come to ask about the rescue. They came to talk. Some cried, some hugged Valor and Hope like they were long-lost friends. Some just needed to be heard. Jack realized that what he had with these dogs, this little sanctuary, was something other people were desperately seeking: peace, healing, and belonging. One snowy evening, Jack sat on his porch with Helen and the dogs lying at their feet. "You've started something, you know," she said, sipping hot cider. "I didn't mean to," Jack replied. "I know," Helen smiled. "That's why it's working." Hope rested her head in Jack's lap, her breathing steady and strong. Valor sat alert beside them, his eyes fixed on the moonlight glistening on the snow-covered trees. Jack looked around at the home he'd built, the dogs he'd saved, the letters stacked beside his boots, and said, "It's time to do more." Helen raised an eyebrow. More. Jack nodded slowly. "There are other dogs out there. Other vets too. Lost, hurting, waiting for someone to see them. Maybe it's not just my job to save Hope and Valor. Maybe it's my job to give others a reason to care again." He stood, looked at the horizon beyond the pine trees, and added, "I want to build something real." Helen smiled. "What do you want to call it?" Jack paused. Then he looked at the old collar hanging by his fireplace, Shadow's collar. And answered, "Shadow's Refuge." Spring crept into Montana like a whisper, softening the snow, coaxing green buds from frosted branches, and bringing new life to the woods. At Jack Morrison's cabin, change wasn't just in the weather, it was everywhere. The story of Hope and Valor hadn't faded. In fact, it had only grown stronger. Across the country, animal rescue groups and veteran organizations had reached out after seeing Jack's viral interview. What began as letters of gratitude turned into phone calls, Zoom meetings, and eventually, action. With Helen's help and advice from veteran outreach networks, Jack filed paperwork to establish a nonprofit, Shadow's Refuge. The mission was simple but powerful: rescue neglected dogs, rehabilitate them, then pair them with veterans battling PTSD, loneliness, or grief. The first few weeks were overwhelming. Jack, who'd lived in near isolation for years, now found himself fielding questions about zoning laws, nonprofit registrations, fundraising permits, and animal care protocols. It was new territory, but he attacked it with military precision and the same drive that once carried him through battle zones. Slow is smooth. Smooth is fast, he told himself, repeating a phrase Shadow's trainer used to say. Meanwhile, Valor and Hope were thriving. Hope had gained weight and confidence. Her fur almost fully regrown. She still moved cautiously but no longer winced when touched. Valor, once reserved, now stood guard outside Jack's cabin, alert but calm. They were no longer just survivors, they were ambassadors. The first major breakthrough came in the form of a donation, $50,000 from a retired Air Force officer in Texas who had seen Jack's interview. "I buried 2 friends who didn't make it home," in the head. The letter read, "I think you're building something that may have saved them." The money allowed Jack to purchase the adjoining 3 acres of land near his cabin. He cleared brush with Valor trotting beside him, built 3 insulated kennels with the help of local volunteers, and fenced off a large, secure play yard. Helen oversaw the medical side: vaccinations, exams, emergency protocols. A small team of volunteers joined in, many of them veterans themselves, eager to contribute. But perhaps the most important addition came from a man named Luis Ramirez, a former Navy corpsman who had once trained therapy dogs for wounded soldiers. He'd seen Jack's story while recovering from his 3rd surgery. When Luis arrived at the cabin limping, slightly but smiling, he said, "I don't want a paycheck. I want to help save lives, like someone once did for me." And just like that, the core team of Shadows Refuge was born. Within a month, they rescued their first dog, a battered Labrador mix named Maggie, found tied behind a trailer home in a nearby county, starving and covered in fleas. With patience, food, and care, Maggie transformed, and when Marine veteran Tony Dillergruff, sleepless and emotionally shut down, visited the refuge, Maggie walked up to him without hesitation and placed her paw in his lap. Tony cried for the first time in 12 years. That moment sealed it for Jack. This was what he was meant to do. Soon after, the stories multiplied. A young Army vet named Jasmine, who hadn't left her apartment in months, bonded with a sweet hound named Blue. An amputee named Mark found comfort in Ginger, a shy golden retriever who'd been rescued from a hoarder's home. Every connection was unique. Every rescue mattered. Jack kept a handwritten journal of every pair, dog and human. He logged their stories, their first meetings, and their progress. The journal sat beside Shadow's collar on the mantle, growing thicker each week. The media returned again and again, but Jack kept the focus where it belonged. Not on him, but on the healing happening in the refuge. When a major news station asked to do a live broadcast from his property, Jack agreed, but only if the segment included interviews with the veterans and highlighted dogs available for adoption. He stood at the edge of the new training yard during the taping, arms crossed, with Hope and Valor at his sides. Both dogs stood tall and proud, wearing harnesses labeled "Therapy Dog in Training." "They're the reason I'm still standing," Jack told the reporter. "And now, they're helping others stand too." That night, Shadows Refuge received its largest wave of donations yet, enough to begin constructing a small indoor facility with sleeping quarters for visiting veterans, an on-site vet room, and more kennels. Helen called it a sanctuary. With a soul, veterans across the country began reaching out to visit. Many brought their own rescued animals, others came with nothing but heavy hearts and sleepless eyes and left with a newfound sense of peace. One veteran, a quiet man named Rob, who hadn't spoken a full sentence since returning from Iraq, left a week after arriving with a stray mutt named Tank. Before leaving, he turned to Jack and simply said, "Thank you. You reminded me I'm not done yet." Jack never forgot that. As summer rolled in, Shadows Refuge hosted its first open event, Honor and Pause Day. Veterans, families, and supporters came from as far as California and Maine. Food trucks lined the clearing, kids played with puppies, and Jack gave a short, heartfelt speech by the fire pit where he first told Hope and Valor, "You're safe now." He ended his speech with something simple, but deeply true. "People think I rescued these dogs. Truth is, they rescued me first." The crowd applauded, some cried. Hope barked once, as if to confirm every word. Later that night, as the stars filled the sky above the refuge, Jack sat beside the fire. Valor lay at his feet. Hope rested her head on his boot. The music had faded, the crowd gone home, but the feeling remained. Peace, connection, meaning. Shadows Refuge was no longer just a vision. It was real, it was working, and it was just getting started. As Shadows Refuge grew, so did the challenges. Jack Morrison, who had spent years navigating the dangers of war, now found himself facing a different kind of battle, one fought with paperwork, fundraising hurdles, and community skepticism. The early excitement that had surrounded the refuge began to wane for some, and sustaining momentum required more than passion. It demanded relentless perseverance. One bitterly cold morning in early autumn, Jack sat at his cluttered kitchen table, staring at a stack of unpaid bills and letters from suppliers. The kennel repairs needed after the recent snowstorm were overdue, and the veterinary bills for Hope, Valor, and other dogs climbed higher every week. His phone buzzed constantly with messages from volunteers, donors, and vets, many asking for updates or assistance. The reality hit hard. Passion alone couldn't keep Shadows Refuge afloat. But Jack was no stranger to adversity. He remembered a lesson from his military days. Every problem had a solution if you were willing to look hard enough. he called a meeting with Helen, Luis, and Sarah Clemens, the journalist who had first told his story. Together, they brainstormed fundraising ideas, grant applications, and community outreach programs. We need to build local support, Helen insisted. People want to see the impact, Luis nodded. Veterans groups, too. They have networks we can tap into. Sarah pulled out her phone. I can help with social media campaigns and find sponsors. Jack felt a surge of hope. They were a team now stronger together. Their first breakthrough came with a local business owner, Mrs. Anderson, who owned a chain of pet supply stores. After visiting the refuge and meeting the dogs, she offered a monthly sponsorship deal and hosted adoption events at her stores. Slowly, other local businesses followed. Meanwhile, Jack continued visiting veterans centers across Montana, sharing his story and inviting vets to Shadow's refuge. Word spread that this was a place where people and animals healed together. But progress wasn't without setbacks. One afternoon, Jack received a call from the clinic. Hope's infection had returned, more aggressive this time. She was weak again, and Helen warned that her lungs might be permanently damaged. Jack didn't sleep that night, pacing the cabin floor with Hope in his arms, whispering promises he hoped to keep. But even in the darkest moments, there were sparks of joy. Valor learned new commands under Luce's patient guidance. Veterans who once hesitated to leave their rooms now laughed openly while playing fetch. Maggie, the battered lab, finally found a forever home with a family nearby. Jack realized that healing wasn't linear. It was messy, unpredictable, and sometimes painful but worth every step. Then came the day that tested everything. A powerful storm swept through the area, knocking out power and flooding parts of the refuge. The dogs had to be moved indoors, and volunteers scrambled to secure the kennels and supplies. Jack worked nonstop for hours, guiding helpers and calming frightened dogs, his military discipline kicking in full force. When the storm passed, the damage was clear, but so was the community's resolve. Donations poured in to repair the refuge, and neighbors volunteered to help rebuild. Jack's phone rang non-stop with offers of assistance from vets and animal lovers nationwide. Through it all, Hope remained by Jack's side, fragile but fighting. Valor was her constant guardian. One chilly evening, after weeks of treatment, Hope took her first unassisted steps outside. Jack cheered quietly, tears streaming down his face. "You did it, girl," he said softly. The journey had been long and hard, but each victory, big or small, was a triumph. As winter approached again, Jack sat by the fire with Helen and Luis, reflecting on the year. "We've come so far," Helen said, "but there's still work to do." Luis smiled, "And we'll keep doing it together." Jack looked at Hope and Valor resting nearby, then out the window at the darkening sky. "For them," he said, "and for every lost soul out there waiting to be found." Winter's grip had loosened, and the first buds of spring pushed through the thawing earth near Jack Morrison's cabin. The quiet Montana woods, once a place of solitude, had become a sanctuary of life and hope. Shadow's refuge was no longer just a dream. It was a movement. Inside the warmed cabin, Jack sat at the hearth with Hope and Valor close by. Their breaths rose in soft puffs of steam as they relaxed, safe and loved. The scars of their pasts had faded, not erased, but transformed into badges of resilience. Jack looked at the two dogs and felt a swell of gratitude. They had saved him as much as he had saved them. Their journey had sparked something far greater than any one person could have imagined. A knock at the door stirred the peaceful moment. Jack opened it to find a group of veterans, men and women, young and old, standing with dogs of all shapes and sizes. Some dogs wagged tails excitedly. Others rested quietly at their owner's feet. Their eyes held stories of pain, struggle, and survival just like Jack's. One by one, the veterans stepped inside, greeted by Helen, Luis, and volunteers, who had become family. The refuge was bustling with life, an open house celebrating the bonds between humans and their canine companions. Jack cleared his throat and addressed the group. "Thank you all for being here," he began. "This place started because two dogs were left to die in the snow, and because I was lost. But none of us are lost anymore. Together, we're building something stronger." He gestured toward Hope and Valor. "These dogs remind us that no matter how cold and dark the world gets, there's always a chance to find warmth, to find family, to find purpose." A woman named Jasmine stepped forward, tears shining in her eyes. She held a leash connected to Blue, the hound who had helped pull her out of isolation. "This place saved me," she said softly, "and the dogs saved me first." Others nodded, voices catching as they shared brief stories of nights without sleep, battles with demons unseen, and the healing power of pause and unconditional love. Jack felt the weight of every word. The refuge wasn't just about dogs or veterans. It was about hope. Later that evening, as the group gathered around a fire pit outside, laughter and conversation mingled with the crisp night air. Hope lay nestled beside Jack's feet, Valor alert, but calm. Helen joined him quietly. "You've changed lives," she said. Jack shook his head gently. "They changed mine first." The sky above was a blanket of stars, steady, constant, infinite. Jack took a deep breath. There will always be storms, he said, but as long as we have each other, people and dogs, we can face anything. Hope looked up, her eyes meeting Jack's with a quiet understanding. Thank you, he whispered. For the first time in years, Jack Morrison felt truly home. The future bright, hopeful, and full of promise stretched wide before him.